Hey everybody, this is Chapter 5 of Capitalism and Class Struggle in the USSR by Neil C. Fernandez. Chapter 5 is titled The Class Struggle, a Critique of, quote, Marxist, end quote, theories. And here we go. In this chapter we consider the most important, quote, Marxist theories of the nature of the Soviet Union from a single standpoint, namely focusing on how they approach the matter of the working class. Sorry, gotta get to the footnotes, or the endnotes. Endnote. For an explanation of the significance of the inverted commas around the word, quote, Marxist, see Chapter 1 above. Marxist work is considered in Chapter 6. End footnote. In each case, we are interested in particular in how the overall view of the system relates to a theoretical understanding of working class struggle. We divide the theories into three sets, according to whether these theories view the USSR as a, quote, degenerated workers' state, a, quote, capitalist formation, or a, quote, mode of production sui generis. The third group we subdivide further into early, quote, collectivist theories, East European, quote, dissident theories, later, quote, collectivist theories, and a more recent, quote, mode of production theory. Footnote. In the present context, it is impossible to cover the full gamut of, quote, Marxist works mentioning the USSR, many of which, for example, Marcuse's, quote, imminent critique of the reigning Soviet ideology, published in 1958, have dealt only peremptorily, if at all, with actual Soviet production relations and the actual working class. We have therefore restricted consideration to the various critical theories of the material reality. Reasons for excluding, quote, Euro-communist and official Soviet and Chinese works are given in the introduction. End footnote. New section. The, quote, degenerated workers' state, end quote. The first position to be considered is the one formulated by Trotsky, the former war commissar and rival to Stalin, expelled from the Communist Party in 1927. In exile, Trotsky arrived at a, quote, Bonapartist, end quote, explanation of the origins of Stalinism. In the present context, though, it is not that which interests us, but rather his ideas about the role of the working class within the society as a whole. In The Revolution Betrayed, published 1936, subtitled, What is the Soviet Union and Where is it Going?, Trotsky makes a number of statements about the working class which to the Marxist ear sound quite contradictory. At one point, Trotsky scorns the announcement in Pravda that the Soviet worker, quote, is not a wage slave and is not the seller of a commodity called labor power, end quote, and asserts that, quote, the transfer of the factories to the state changed the situation of the worker only juridically, end quote. Given Trotsky's subsequent explanation that what characterizes classes is, quote, their position in the social system of economy, and primarily, their relation to the means of production, end quote, one would therefore be forgiven for thinking that what Trotsky sees as a purely juridical change in workers' conditions has left the working class as a class exploited by capitalism. But such is not Trotsky's view, and only a few pages later, having argued that, quote, the nationalization of the land, the means of industrial production, transport, and exchange, together with the monopoly of foreign trade, constitute the basis of the Soviet social structure, end quote. Trotsky goes on to assert that these relations were sufficient to establish the, quote, nature of the Soviet Union as a proletarian state, end quote. Trotsky's confusion deepens when Trotsky then proceeds to describe how, if the means of production belong to the state, quote, the state, so to speak, quote, belongs, end quote, to the bureaucracy, end quote. We are thus left with a state that was proletarian even if it was owned by a bureaucracy, and even if that bureaucracy was, quote, in the full sense of the word, the sole privileged and commanding stratum, end quote, in the society. Accepting that the source of the bureaucracy's power and income was the state property under its command, Trotsky argues bizarrely that it was precisely this aspect of its activity which preserved it as a, quote, weapon of proletarian dictatorship, end quote. If we concentrate on Trotsky's view of the conditions endured by the working class, we see that Trotsky accepts that workers are obliged to sell their labor power and that property relations are such that the surplus product is extracted by a bureaucracy. But nonetheless, in Trotsky's opinion, quote, the character of the economy as a whole depends on the character of the state power, end quote. And the character of the state power is, quote, proletarian, owing to the allegedly, quote, proletarian nature of the Bolshevik coup and the nationalization measures introduced after 1917. Footnote. It is earlier argued in the platform of the left opposition that, quote, the appropriation of surplus value by a worker state is not, of course, exploitation, end quote. Platform of the left opposition. This is in total contradiction with Marx's critique of political economy, which famously links surplus value, abstract labor, wage labor, and capitalist exploitation. But it is quite in keeping with the view Trotsky put forward when Trotsky was near the helm of the state, when Trotsky was keen to portray labor militarization, one-man management, and the generalization of peace rates as weapons wielded in the interests of the working class and socialism. End footnote. Just for a refresher, the United Opposition was a group formed in the All-Union Communist Party Bolsheviks in early 1926, when the left opposition led by Leon Trotsky merged with the new opposition led by Grigory Zinoviev and his close ally Lev Kamenev in order to strengthen opposition against the Stalin-led center. The United Opposition demanded, among other things, greater freedom of expression within the Communist Party, the dismantling of the new economic policy, more development of heavy industry, and less bureaucracy. The group was effectively destroyed by Stalin's majority by the end of 1927, having had only limited success. Back to the text. End footnote. The only possible conclusion to draw from this is that workers' conditions are of minimal importance to the underlying nature of the system, which remains at bottom proletarian. Footnote. Interestingly, this view is echoed by the Soviet, quote, dissident, Roy Medvedev, who in his largely empirical tome on Stalinism states his opinion, in agreement with, quote, most Soviet historians, end quote, that, quote, Stalin's personal dictatorship did not completely abolish the dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. In Roy Medvedev's view, quote, Stalin introduced many bureaucratic distortions into the system of the proletarian dictatorship, but Stalin could not completely destroy the system. Stalin received his mandate from the proletarian Leninist Party after the victory of a socialist revolution. He did a poor job of carrying out the historical mission assigned to him, but he did carry it out to some extent, not only in the 20s, but also in the 30s and 40s, in the struggle against imperialism. For example, unlimited personal power was a form, the worst possible form, of the proletarian dictatorship. It was clearly inconsistent with the nature of the regime. And severely checked progress toward communism, end quote. Roy Medvedev. In another equally empirical work, Roy Medvedev views Stalinism in terms of, quote, excesses, and asserts without elaboration that, quote, many achievements of the October Revolution were not totally destroyed by Stalinism, pseudo-socialism has not managed to root out all elements of socialism from our social, economic, and political life, end quote. Roy Medvedev. Here, too, Roy Medvedev gives no consideration to the conditions of the working class. End footnote. Wikipedia says Roy Medvedev is a Russian politician and writer. He is the author of The Dissident History of Stalinism, Let History Judge, first published in 1972. Back to the text. Or did I say end footnote already? Where am I? This is not to say, however, that Trotsky is not critical of those conditions, for in fact Trotsky makes no bones about criticizing injustice, oppression, differential consumption, and so on, even if Trotsky had supported them when Trotsky himself was in the elite. Indeed, Trotsky even reaches the point, in 1939, of condemning the Soviet, quote, workers' state, end quote, as, quote, counter-revolutionary, end quote. But the only explanation Trotsky gives of the extent of workers' hardships is in relation to the, quote, degeneration, end quote, of the party he once helped lead, itself supposedly caused by scarcity, and it cannot be said that Trotsky pays attention to forms of working class resistance, that is, struggle, at any level. Instead, Trotsky restricts himself to issuing calls to Soviet workers to defend the Soviet state, the, quote, fortress of the toilers, end quote, and to deal with their problems by forming a new but traditional party, the legitimate heir of Lenin's, which would reestablish Leninist norms and clear out the, quote, parasites. Trotsky's most important follower in the, quote, degenerated workers' state camp has been Ernest Mandel, who also identifies Soviet conditions as, quote, transitional, end quote, between capitalism and socialism. Like Trotsky, Mandel bases this thesis upon the nationalized ownership of the means of production and the, quote, proletarian, end quote, nature of the Bolshevik seizure of power. As a consequence of his, quote, workers' statist position, Mandel creates an absolute theoretical division between, on one side, the interests of the bureaucratic elite, and on the other, the concrete relations of that elite with the working class. Thus he explains the massive growth rates of Stalinism with reference only to the, quote, absence of the rule of the law of value, end quote, which for Mandel means the presence of some kind of planning, and proceeds to assert that the, quote, material privileges of the bureaucracy are essentially restricted to the sphere of consumption, end quote. Footnote. For the Trotskyist view of the, quote, contradiction between the non-capitalist mode of production and the bourgeois norms of distribution, end quote, see Ernest Mandel, 1968. For those who adopt a Marxist viewpoint, it is clear that the contradiction that Trotskyists see between the relations of production and the relations of distribution simply cannot exist. As Marx puts it, quote, the relations and modes of distribution appear merely as the obverse of the relations of production, ... The structure of distribution is completely determined by the structure of production, end quote. Marx, end footnote. We are thus left without any consideration of accumulation in terms of production relations, as well as confused about in whose interest the accumulation actually took place, since it clearly did not take place in the interests of the workers. In other words, Mandel has no objective theory of the accumulation of the surplus product and its reemployment in production, without which the elite would not have administered any growth at all. The category of control over the working class, as a necessary feature of an economy which was founded upon accumulation but was not run by the workers, is completely absent. It follows, therefore, that Mandel has no theory either of workers' obstruction of this control, When Mandel turns his attention to the crisis of the system, Mandel can only be said to adopt a class perspective in the most superficial sense. Workers' organization and struggle in the Gorbachev period thus appear simply as the result of poor living standards, and their development is identified above all with activity within the political space opened up by glasnost. Failing to analyze how the nature of the system was determined by the nature of class struggle, Mandel explicitly denies that the malfunctioning of the system had anything to do with workers' quote, laziness or quote, lack of drive. For Mandel, waste resulted exclusively from bureaucratic mismanagement. Mandel is consequently able to write about the historical roots of the crisis in 1991 without mentioning class struggle at all. New section, quote, Capitalism. We have already considered the views of the main, quote, capitalist theorists upon the nature of the Soviet system. We shall now consider their understanding of the Soviet working class. With allowance for the fact that contributions made by the Council Communists, Buick and Crump, Johnson Forrest, and the Socialist Party of Great Britain, all, quote, state capitalist, end quote, as well as those by Gorder, Castoriadis, and Chattopadhyay, quote, capitalist, will be considered in Chapter 6. The order in which the remaining analyses will be considered is the same as in Chapter 2. We shall first take the, quote, state capitalist theories produced by Andres Wilt, Grandizo Muniz, Tony Cliff, Charles Bettelheim, Chavance, Sapir, and then the, quote, capitalist, end quote, theory argued by Bordiga. Quote, state capitalist, end quote, theories. Many conceptions of, quote, state capitalism, end quote, give hardly any theoretical consideration to the position of the working class, other than to record the working class's exploitation and subjugation. Not surprisingly, these include the various conceptions based on views of the system which themselves lack substantial theoretical foundation. Footnote. These are considered above in Chapter 2, Note 1, in relation to the working class. The Menshevik Yugov writes of low wages and poor labor conditions, but not of resistance and struggle. One second. And the same is true of Urevsky, writing a few years later, in 1932. The social democrat Kautsky, meanwhile, who also for a time writes of Soviet, quote, state capitalism, focuses mainly on political despotism and terror rather than on the specific contradictions of class relations. In 1919, the parenthesis communist and parenthesis workers group and workers truth group, for their part, although they participated in the strikes of 1923, are not known to have produced any theoretical work on the class struggle. And the anarchist Volin writes little about working class conditions of a theoretical nature, other than to aver that the state's role as the only employer means the worker is a, quote, slave. See Volin, 1947. Volin's consideration of class resistance under Stalinism is restricted to a brief reference to the sabotage and revenge attacks which occurred in response to Stakhanovism. End footnote. They also include the view presented by Wilt, which is on this channel, of course, who holds that Soviet, quote, totalitarian state capitalism, end quote, made all, quote, all effective opposition, end quote, impossible. Or in other words, that subjugation was absolute and the class struggle did not exist. New section. Leninist theories of Muniz and Cliff. Or Muniz, probably. Even Muniz, whose overall analysis of the political economic conditions is focused around the category of the surplus product, proves unable to go beyond political rhetoric when writing about the working class. Thus, for Muniz, quote, the extreme poles have for years been as follows. On the extreme right, the bureaucracy. On the extreme left, the proletariat, end quote. Muniz's understanding of these, quote, poles never becomes any more substantial than this. And a few pages later, Muniz avers that the proletariat's part in social distribution, which presumably includes the determination of its own income, is, quote, precisely that of a slave, end quote. Muniz. On a general level, Cliff too offers a theorization seemingly capable of development, insofar as Cliff draws a crucial connection between, on one hand, the subordination of consumption to accumulation, and on the other, the subordination of the workers to the means of production. As with Muniz's work, there is no doubt that this is a more profound point than appears in Trotsky and Mandel's critique of, quote, parasites, end quote. Furthermore, having identified the Soviet elite as a ruling class, Muniz does at least devote a chapter to the class struggle. But it turns out to be the concluding chapter, and to consist of a mere 12 pages, whilst referring to a, quote, relation of forces between the proletariat and the bureaucracy, end quote. Cliff. Sorry, I fucked up that last paragraph. I think I said Muniz when I meant to say Cliff. On a general level, Cliff too offers a theorization seemingly capable of development insofar as Cliff draws a crucial connection between, on one hand, the subordination of consumption to accumulation, and on the other, the subordination of the workers to the means of production. As with Muniz's work, there is no doubt that this is a more profound point than appears in Trotsky and Mandel's critique of, quote, parasites. Furthermore, having identified the Soviet elite as a ruling class, Cliff does at least devote a chapter to the class struggle. But the chapter on the class struggle turns out to be the concluding chapter and to consist of a mere 12 pages. Whilst referring to a, quote, relation of forces between the proletariat and the bureaucracy, end quote, Cliff fails to ask what for the Marxists is the crucial question. What form did the workers' struggle take? Instead, Cliff looks at how the, quote, more experienced and intelligent, end quote, workers were often able to travel upwards in the bureaucratic hierarchy, how the working class underwent a, quote, dilution by raw elements, end quote, and how these two factors combined to obstruct the rise of an independent, read politically represented, workers' movement. No attempt is made to build on Cliff's brief earlier reference to sabotage as a weapon used against economism. Instead, we read of, quote, unlimited egoism, end quote, a bureaucracy that spreads lies without limits, and even, quote, the absolute suppression of the masses, end quote. Like Muniz, Tony Cliff paints a picture somewhat similar to the one presented by the, quote, totalitarian, end quote, Sovietologist, and the whole idea of a, quote, relation of forces, end quote, a struggle, not being fleshed out, seems simply to vanish. What we are left with are merely comments on how improvements in the standard of living and culture would lead to increasing self-confidence and a growing impatience with the lack of bourgeois rights, whilst the absence of such improvements would sooner or later lead to, quote, revolts of despair, end quote. Tony Cliff summarizes his position in the following terms. One day a spontaneous explosion for the time being... Cliff summarizes his position in the following terms. One day, a spontaneous explosion. For the time being, quote, the volcano seems extinct, end quote. Tony Cliff. Writing in 1971, Harman, I think that's Chris Harman, 2, restricts his consideration of class struggle to events that might happen in the future. End footnote. After the eruptions in the USSR and elsewhere in 1989, Cliff's ideas were applied to the changing state of affairs by Harman. I don't know why I keep wanting to say Harman. In, quote, The Storm Breaks, end quote, published in 1990, Chris Harman suggests that the Soviet system entered crisis because the Soviet system was unable to keep up with the worldwide shift towards, quote, multinational capitalism, end quote. The crisis of the, quote, old forms of rule, end quote, consequently brought about, quote, enormous popular discontent, end quote, and that in turn created pressure for a transition to a new form of capitalist rule. Quote, the transition itself involves disruption to the mechanisms which have kept the discontent in check in the past, the political and ideological apparatuses of the ruling class. The greater the level of accumulation and the levels of repression needed to sustain it, the greater the possibility of the mass of people taking advantage of this disruption to give expression to accumulated bitterness in a huge explosion of anger and action, end quote. Chris Harman. Thus, it cannot be said that Chris Harman is unaware of there being a relationship between crisis and class struggle. But what exactly is this relationship? What caused the crisis in the first place? By asking these questions, we can see that Chris Harman is a long way away from hypostatizing the antagonism between classes. In fact, when writing about the proletariat as the, quote, gravedigger, end quote, which undermines Soviet capitalism throughout its history, Chris Harman refers only to the proletariat's growth in size and the rise in the proletariat's level of culture and education, and completely neglects even to mention the working class's practice, or the proletariat's practice. Since Chris Harman views things not from a class point of view, but rather from a Leninist, quote, party view, according to which the, quote, potential of the working class is similar to steam to be, quote, directed, it is quite logical that faced with the crisis, Chris Harman ends up calling for support for political and even nationalist reforms. 2 footnotes. First footnote. We would note here that Cliff clearly defends the use of force over the workers, albeit mediated through the, quote, workers' state, end quote. Quote, in the transition period, bracket, between capitalism and, quote, socialism, end bracket, labor discipline, end bracket, will be the outcome of the unity, bracket, sick, end bracket, of the two elements, consciousness and coercion, ... Whereas the workers will be both a disciplining and a disciplined factor, a subject and an object, the technicians will serve in reality as a transmission belt, this time of the workers' state, even if the technicians remain formally discipliners of the workers, end quote. Tony Cliff, 1955. What appears to be an attempt at a dialectical conceptualization is in fact simply a representation of the familiar ideology of the modern representative state. End footnote. Next footnote. Quote, part of taking advantage of the political crisis of the transition is pushing to the limit the democratic demands of the radical Democrats, ... end quote. Quote, the majority workers, or at least the conscious socialists among the majority workers, have to stand by the right of the national minority to form the national minority's own state if the national minority wants to, regardless of the form of the state the minority chooses to establish, ... The only way workers among the minority nationality will break from ... bracket, petty bourgeois or petty bureaucratic, end bracket, leadership is if the workers among the minority nationality see a socialist workers' movement among the majority nationality which is prepared to fight in a more effective way than these leaders, these nationalist leaders, against the reality of national oppression, end quote. Chris Harman, end footnote. One second. New section. Bettelheim's theory and related work. The author of the other best-known, quote, state capitalist theory, alongside Cliff's, namely Bettelheim, provides just as little analysis as Cliff does of the actual conditions of class struggle under, quote, state capitalism. Thus, most of his references to the working class are either statements concerning negatives, such as the non-subordination of the state to the laboring masses, or the absence of a, quote, or the absence of an adequate, quote, ideological revolutionization, end quote, of the workers, or else they take the form of rare asides concerning ideologically reinforced social immobility, other, quote, ideological relations, end quote, or the power of managers to, quote, invoke means of repression, end quote, and sack their employees. Although Bettelheim does not explicitly say that workers do not or cannot resist the conditions of exploitation, nor does Bettelheim ever say that they can and do resist the conditions of exploitation. Footnote. Concerning the earlier periods, though, Bettelheim is confused rather than silent. Thus Bettelheim refers to the, quote, blocking, end quote, of any organized action by the proletariat, quote, to transform the production relations, end quote, but gives the main reason as being the adoption of incorrect ideological theses by officialdom. Meanwhile, when discussing the tightening of labor discipline in 1918-20, Bettelheim still asserts that, quote, this resort to coercion was only the secondary aspect of a situation whose principal aspect was the constitution of the proletariat as the dominant class, end quote. Bettelheim. Workers who resisted were selfish and, quote, strongly influenced by bourgeois and petty bourgeois ideas and practices, end quote. The same lens is also used to look at the struggles of the winter of 1920-21, including the uprising at Kronstadt. Bettelheim is less negative about the growth in workers' resistance to managerial authority in 1928, but blames the defeat of the, quote, mass movement, end quote, mainly on the mass movement's lack or loss of support from within the party. Bettelheim's failure to identify worker struggle, quote, in itself, end quote, is shown by Bettelheim's very, quote, Maoist, end quote, attribution to General Secretary Stalin of a, quote, ambiguous, end quote, attitude. On the one hand, genuinely calling for a continuation of, quote, mass criticism from below, end quote, and for, quote, cultural revolution, end quote, whilst on the other, quote, hesitating, end quote, to advocate a new form of, quote, really authoritative leadership, end quote. Bettelheim. End footnote. Hence the question of how the workers resist the conditions of exploitation is one that Bettelheim does not even approach. Chavant's, meanwhile, his work follows on from Bettelheim's, does not let this omission stand in his way. This appears to be referring to Bernard Chavant's, professor of economics at the University of Paris, Diderot, France. Bernard Chavant has published several books on comparative economic systems and institutions, particularly on socialist systems and post-socialist transformation. Back to the text. Unlike Bettelheim, Bernard Chavant understands fully that the, quote, pressure from the base for wage rises, end quote, is a phenomenon which is, quote, inherent in the social contradictions of wage labor, end quote. Although hardly a breakthrough in Marxist thought, this is in fact quite an advance in terms of the, quote, capitalist, end quote, theories of the USSR. Chavance is aware both of the gap between, quote, planned, end quote, wages and the wages actually received, and of the rise in consumption levels up to the 1970s. In this connection, Bernard Chavance then points to the poor quality of goods as being a sort of countervailing factor. Underlying such phenomena, Chavance identifies exclusively the absence or near absence of unemployment, which Chavance relates to the microeconomic shortage of labor. Although Chavance does strive here to formulate a class-based critique of the overall Soviet political economy, the weakness of Chavance's account is quite straightforward. Chavance omits to consider class struggle at the point of production. As a consequence, Chavance neglects to consider the quality of goods precisely where it first appears, in the labor process. Apart from giving the observations noted above, Chavance thus finds himself unable to analyze labor relations in such a way as to enhance the overall critique. The tension between workers and the workers' conditions of exploitation, or between workers in the bureaucratic center, appears simply as another characteristic of the Soviet system, alongside such phenomena as passive money, inconvertibility, and the shadow economy. It is considered only in terms of a structure-related, quote, conflict of interest, end quote, not in terms of struggle, as something inherent but not fundamental. Sapir also adopts Bettelheim's view of, quote, state capitalism, but for Sapir's part has written more extensively on the workers, having described the initial, quote, suppression, end quote, of unemployment as a means by which the authorities crushed labor turnover as a form of resistance. Sapir proceeds to show how inside the factories there persisted a, quote, partial or, quote, technical unemployment as an intrinsic part of the, quote, shortage economy. This unemployment within the workplace formed a contrasting backdrop to the well-known practice of end-of-period, quote, storming. In a subsequent work devoted specifically to, quote, work and the workers, end quote, Sapir then considers mobility and storming in finer empirical detail. More importantly, Sapir also pays notable attention to, quote, skiving, end quote, progul, lateness, unofficial breaks, black work, and pilfering. Having concentrated earlier upon how workers are constrained to act, Sapir has thus progressed to a consideration of how the workers choose to act. If this undoubtedly marks a development in his thought, though, it unfortunately remains an analytical and theoretical step of which Sapir himself seems completely unaware, and upon which Sapir altogether fails to build. When we look for a theoretical conception of the overall relationship between class relations and the nature of the system, we find that this work displays a consistency of the most, quote, objectivist, end quote, kind. In 1980, Sapir does relate the strikes of 1962 to 63 and 1969 to 70 to the government's reform attempts. But Sapir nonetheless places a general emphasis primarily upon the problems caused by an economic institutionalization of forms which are best suited to the period of intensive accumulation and which from the ruler's viewpoint have become increasingly dysfunctional. With such an approach, any dynamic of class relations will appear as merely epiphenomenal. This becomes clearer when Sapir considers the world of Soviet work in greater detail. In describing rising labor turnover, alcoholism, and systematic breaches of labor discipline as products of, quote, problems born from the crisis of regimentation, end quote, Sapir thus notably fails to consider how such behavior on the part of the workers might have contributed to creating such a crisis in the first place. In this view, the, quote, dysfunctions of the Soviet economy, whose consequences are felt especially in the area of work and work's rhythms, end quote, are, quote, inherent, end quote, in the existence of a high degree of competition for resources, both at enterprise level and between enterprises and ministries. Footnote. A, quote, high degree of competition, end quote, or more accurately, generalized competition, is actually part of the basis of capitalism everywhere. End footnote. In the conclusion of his book, Sapir explains that these two, quote, competing forms of economic logic, end quote, determine both the existence of full employment and the absence of a harmonious workplace rhythm. In the empirical consideration, then, he may refer occasionally to the class struggle, but in his overarching understanding of the Soviet political economy, this struggle is not a basic factor. In considering the place of the workers, he does refer to contradiction and to conflict, but only the, quote, poles, end quote, which Sapir defines in this connection, are those of, quote, integration and, quote, mediation. Since these latter two terms properly relate to what happens between polarities, Sapir's formulation appears to be deprived of substantive meaning, but it nonetheless serves to demonstrate Sapir's lack of attention with regard to the consequences of the fundamental class relation. More recently, Sapir has expressed a view of the influence of the labor shortage upon workers' behavior, which is self-evidently mechanical, the prime connecting factor ostensibly being constituted by the, quote, permissiveness of the enterprises, that is, of enterprise directors. One second. New section. Other, quote, capitalist, end quote, theory. Footnote. Messeros's work does not fit easily into our system of classification by reason of Messeros's denial that the USSR was capitalist at the same time that Messeros accepts that it was based on capital. On the one hand, Messeros argues the bureaucrats who personified capital in the USSR, unlike their capitalist counterparts, quote, could not exercise even a limited autonomy, end quote. On the other, quote, labor could not be fragmented and atomized on the model of the capitalist labor process, end quote. Istvan Messeros. 3 reasons are given as to why the capitalist type of atomization was impossible. First, quote, the immense enterprise of industrialization, as well as forced collectivization and forced industrialization, end quote, demanded, quote, the highest degree of the socialization of production, end quote, which affected workers' consciousness. Second, the, quote, ground of legitimation of, quote, building socialism, end quote, was the working class, and all talk about the, quote, proletarian dictatorship, end quote, and the, quote, leading role of the party, end quote, in it had to exclude quite explicitly the possibility of capitalist restoration and the subjection of labor to the alienating fetishism of the commodity, end quote. End quote. The third reason why the authoritarian discipline to which individual workers were subjected, no matter how severe, could not produce the result desired by the party leadership was that it could never be admitted that the recalcitrance of labor was a matter of class antagonism, end quote. Messeros. We would note that the second and third reasons are solely ideological and essentially boiled down to the view that the rulers were, quote, unable, end quote, either to strive openly for Western-style atomization or to admit that the workers were the enemy. The arguments are not based on an understanding of the political economy. If the rulers could lie about the overall position of the workers, what prevented the rulers from benefiting from atomized private labor and lying about that too? And as for the first reason, labor's atomization into, quote, private labor, end quote, could hardly be problematic for its alienated socialization, when such atomization is actually a necessary condition of precisely that alienated socialization on which the existence of value, and hence of capital, depends. This is quite aside from the weakness of an argument which presents forced industrialization as determining the supposed non-atomization of labor only via its effects on workers' consciousness. Messeros goes on to state that, quote, the workers, however, knew all too well that when the workers were violating the prescribed norms on a mass scale in front of one another, and performing the workers' role at a much lower level of productivity than the workers could, involved in all kinds of, quote, going slow, end quote, moonlighting, end quote, etc. The workers are not acting on behalf of a mysterious outside enemy, but on their own behalf, in solidarity with one another, which made their recalcitrant behavior possible at all in an authoritarian system, end quote. Messeros, emphasis added by Fernandez. Although this is not linked in a straightforward fashion to the subsequent reference to the insufficiency, from the ruler's standpoint, of the fragmentation and alienation of labor, it is undoubtedly a statement about workers' struggle. Despite what appears to be a certain confusion with regard to the fulfillment of norms, it does say something about workers as a struggling collectivity. It is therefore unfortunate that it is not built upon. For our own discussion of the subsumption of labor, productivity, and the power of the workers, see Chapter 7 below. End footnote. Bordiga shows a level of interest in the Soviet working class which is quite as low as Bedelim's. Despite underlining throughout his work that Soviet workers are exploited by capital, in relation to which the state, like all states, occupies a subordinate position, the government being just one committee of the world capitalist class, Bordiga shows little desire to look at the specific conditions of workers endure and the forms of resistance which arise in opposition to those conditions. Thus, in Dialogue with Stalin, Bordiga writes of factory despotism and its Stakhanovist form, but confines Bordiga's consideration of workers' reaction to factory despotism and its Stakhanovist form to a mere half sentence, which is sufficient space to mention, quote, storming, end quote, but insufficient to give any sort of analysis of or explanation. Given such a reference, though, is a rare in the extreme. Even such a reference, though, is rare in the extreme. Footnote. See also the discussion of Bordiga's work in Kamat, 1974. And footnote. Footnote. Bordiga stresses above all that Soviet capitalism at the time Bordiga is writing is still in its, quote, developing, end quote, phase, and it is in this connection that the reason for Bordiga's lack of interest in working class resistance becomes clear. For Bordiga, it is not the onset or reestablishment of this phase which marks the victory, or even the process of, quote, counter-revolution, end quote. But on the contrary, it is the establishment of its permanence and its labeling as national, quote, socialism under Stalin. In the previous period, even if Lenin had seen the development of capitalism as a necessity and denounced those who thought otherwise as, quote, childish and, quote, petty bourgeois, Lenin also saw the development of capitalism as a temporary and did not call it, quote, socialism, end quote. From Bordiga's point of view, the key to the distinction between developing transition and a counter-revolution is not the presence or absence of the categories of capitalism, nor yet the force of workers' actions against them, but the, quote, dictatorship of the International Communist Party, end quote. Bordiga. And footnote. New section. Quote, mode of production sui generis, end quote. Footnote. Whilst Barrow refers to Soviet society as, quote, industrial despotism, end quote, 1977, Barrow's theory is so far removed from class analysis as to exclude itself from consideration in the present context. Quote, the concept of the working class no longer has any definable object in our social system, and what is far more important, it has no object that can appear as a unity in practical action, ... Our society is no longer characterized by a, quote, horizontal, end quote, class division, but rather by a, quote, vertical, end quote, stratification, even if one which still has sharp transition points, ... end quote. Rudolf Barrow. End footnote. The final set of, quote, Marxist positions to be looked at involve the theory that the USSR was neither a, quote, socialist, worker state, nor a capitalist state, nor even a transitional or hybrid formation, but represented rather a new mode of production with that mode of production's own contradictions and its own dynamic. First put forward in the late 1930s, this view has since been espoused and developed by a number of different theorists. First, we consider the work of Bruno Rizzi, James Burnham, and Max Shachtman, then the views of Milovan Žilas, Koran and Modzilevsky, quote, Rakovsky, and Fehr, Heller, and Marcus, then the, quote, collectivist, end quote, views of Carlo and Fantham and Machover, and finally, a recent contribution by Clark. Various other views are commented on in the notes. Footnote. Tichton's theory, which denies the existence of a, quote, mode of production, end quote, in the USSR, is considered to be Marxist rather than, quote, Marxist, and is considered in the following chapter. End footnote. New section. Early, quote, collectivist, end quote, theories. The, quote, bureaucratic collectivist, end quote, thesis originally arose in connection with the idea that capitalism was giving way on a world scale to a new social formation, and the arguments focused on developments in Hitler's Germany, Mussolini's Italy, and Roosevelt's United States, as well as those occurring under Stalin in the USSR. In the Soviet context, Rizzi thus makes it quite clear that Rizzi sees the system as having resolved the contradictions which made capitalism, quote, unprogressive, and Rizzi even leaves the question open as to whether it might be, in the long term, quote, improve the masses' conditions, as to whether the system might, in the long run, quote, improve the masses' conditions of life, end quote. Although Rizzi takes the view that the system was based on the exploitation of one class by another, ultimately, Rizzi does not refer to any sort of struggle between the two classes, and ultimately Rizzi's view of the powerlessness of the working class is extreme as Friedrich and Brzezinski's. Quote, members of the Russian working class are no longer proletarians, they are slaves, both economically speaking and in terms of behavior. Members of the Russian working class kneel when, quote, the little father, end quote, passes and deify him, ... The Russian worker, together with the Russian workers' union, has become part and parcel of the state, ... The Russian worker is made to turn up, sheep-like, at political meetings. The Russian worker is simply an unthinking element of a mass which is there to be manipulated by the bureaucracy, end quote. Bruno Rizzi. And part one of Bruno Rizzi's The Bureaucratization of the World is on this channel. 2 years after Rizzi's work appeared, Burnham published The Managerial Revolution, in which Burnham argues that capitalism is being superseded by, quote, managerial society, end quote, or ruled by a class of managers who control production by means of the state. Having identified, quote, Russia as the country which has progressed furthest along this path of managerial society. Burnham writes, quote, of a triple problem, end quote, for managerial society. Defeating the capitalists, quote, curbing the masses, end quote, so as to eliminate the threat of a classless society, and coping with internal competition, by which Burnham means national competition among, quote, managerial states, end quote. In his view, only the third can ever be solved. The masses, for the masses' part, have already been curbed, end quote. The masses' obscurely felt aspirations towards equalitarianism and a classless society were diverted into the new structure of class rule and organized in terms of the ideologies and institutions of the new social order, end quote. James Burnham. It is sufficient to point out that this assertion, made almost a quarter of a century after the defeat of the workers' revolution, is not backed up with any evidence as to what Soviet workers were doing, what Soviet workers were not doing, or even what kinds of ideas Soviet workers had at the time when Burnham was actually writing the book. Nonetheless, Burnham refers repeatedly to the, quote, masses as having been, quote, curbed. The third main early, quote, collectivist was Shachtman, the author of The Bureaucratic Revolution. This is a side note. I mean, I have a million things by Max Shachtman on here, as well as some things by Burnham. I don't have Managerial Revolution, but the Bureaucratic Revolution was published later. It was a collection of pieces from the 40s and 50s, and I think Shachtman edited them to fit from the original in the Bureaucratic Revolution to fit his more, pro-American position in the 1960s. Unlike Rizzi and Burnham, Shachtman does not apply his view of the new collectivist mode of production either to National Socialism in Germany or to the New Deal in the United States, and consequently does not make comparison a crucial part of his argument. A second difference, more important in the present context, is that Shachtman denies the capacity of, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, or bureaucratic collectivism's reform, to undermine the growth of what Shachtman sees as bureaucratic collectivism's basic contradiction, the conflict of interest between the exploiters and the exploited, but whilst recognizing that a, quote, fundamental revolution, end quote, remains, quote, inescapable, end quote, and underline the inadequacy of reforms for shoring up the system, Shachtman nonetheless gives remarkably little consideration to the actual conditions of struggle in the USSR at the time Shachtman was writing. Thus, when looking at the post-Stalin period, Shachtman identifies the fear of discontent as a major factor motivating the granting of concessions, and even goes so far as to opine that after Stalin, the successor regime could not, quote, even think of maintaining itself without popular support, end quote. Shachtman. But Shachtman fails altogether to relate such insights to any study of exactly how workers resisted, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, in practice. His view of the class relation consequently remains purely one-dimensional. New section. Eastern European, quote, dissident, end quote, theories. The, quote, mode of production sui generis, end quote, theory has also received support from various East European dissidents, beginning with a scholar who should perhaps be classed as the very first dissident of major importance, namely Milovan Žilas. Footnote. On the grounds that they see Eastern Europe and the USSR as socialist, if not also for the fact that they use the terminology and methodology of Weberianism at least as much as they do those of, quote, Marxism, end quote, Conrad and Zeleny, 1979, do not merit consideration in the main text. But by dint of their denial that those countries were, quote, workers' states, end quote, and their use of at least some Marxian terms, they deserve parenthetical mention, for even while asserting that, quote, the social structure of earliest socialism is organized in keeping with the principle of rational redistribution, end quote, and that, quote, in line with the rational principle on which its economy is based. We regard this as a class structure, and indeed a dichotomous class structure, end quote. Conrad and Zeleny. Conrad and Zeleny also recognize that, quote, the interests of the workers are diametrically opposed to those of the redistributors, not only in respect to wages and other shop floor issues, but also in matters of macroeconomic planning as well, end quote. Conrad and Zeleny. Zeleny. How do I say it? Let me read it again. Zeleny. But since Conrad and Zeleny's focus is almost exclusively on the intellectuals, Conrad and Zeleny's analysis of working class interest is linked only tenuously to Conrad and Zeleny's theory of the nature of, quote, rational redistributive society, end quote. Conrad and Zeleny thus argue that workers have an interest in technocratic reform insofar as technocratic reform would create a link between productivity and wage scales, but back this up somewhat unconvincingly with reference to the impetus it would supposedly give to consumer growth and the space it would make in the state budget for faster wage increases. Denying that labor power is sold, Conrad and Zeleny claim that it would be in workers' interest if labor power were sold, since removing the determination of the surplus product from, quote, politics would necessarily mean a rise in relative wages. Why this is so, they do not say. The Romanian theorist Campaniu is equally Weberian and indeed owes a further depth to Parsonian structural functionalism. But despite expressing a preference at the beginning of his work, The Syncretic Society, published in 1980, for the two tools of sociology over those of, quote, political economy, end quote, Campaniu, I don't know if I'm saying his name right, too employs a modicum of apparently, quote, Marxist terminology. In presenting a theory of a, quote, in presenting a theory of a sui generis and anti-capitalist, quote, Stalinist mode of production, end quote, containing both, quote, capitalist and, quote, pre-capitalist elements, Campaniu thus proceeds to relate both kinds of element to the appropriation of labor power. In this view, workers do sell their labor power, but always to the state as a monopsonistic purchaser, completely ignoring questions of labor mobility and of the influence of enterprise directors over wages and norms. Parenthesis. See, for example, Kirsch, 1972, Donald Filzer, 1986, and Donald Filzer, 1992, chapter 4, end parenthesis. Campaniu then asserts in highly vague fashion that the price of labor power, since it is fixed solely by the, quote, subjective decisions of the regime, end quote, does not correspond to labor power's value. The, quote, power of value, end quote, has thus given way to the, quote, value of power, end quote. Consequently, even if the, quote, articulation between production and consumption, end quote, is affected largely by, quote, capitalist mechanisms, end quote, namely the wage relation, the, quote, status, end quote, of labor power in the economy, in terms of the allocation of work and the determination of the magnitude of the wage, remains affected by a political, quote, regime of, quote, pre-capitalist complexion, end quote. In short, the sale of labor power is real, but the sale of labor power is purchase. In short, the sale of labor power is real, but labor power's purchase is a sham. Since Campaniu's rejection of the, quote, tools of political economy, end quote, has necessarily led through Campaniu's work to a methodological separation of the critique of politics from the critique of economics, Campaniu's attempt to bring them back together again must necessarily lead to such, quote, phenomenological, end quote, positions which to the materialist critic appear literally nonsensical. Since class struggle is a matter of political economy and political economy's critique, class struggle has no place in Campaniu's work, but Campeanu clearly holds the view that workers in the USSR are completely powerless. Third, mention must also be made of the Croatian scholar Horvat, who has described the Soviet-type countries as, quote, etatist, end quote. While aiming to write a, quote, Marxist theory of political economy, end quote, Horvat, too, has adopted a Weberian optic in which Horvat's principal discussion of class has been focused upon, quote, stratification, end quote, and the fact that members of the, quote, masses, end quote, have less power than people higher up. In discussing the alienation of labor, though, which Horvat does not link to class, Horvat states somewhat more profoundly that, just as in capitalism, the worker was both an object of bureaucratic political rule and an individual constrained to sell his labor power. However, after then stating that unlike in the bourgeois world, the source of reification under, quote, etatism, end quote, is, quote, not the universalization of market relations, but rather, end bracket, the universalization of bureaucratic relationships, end quote, Horvat arrives at the view that, quote, man is not reduced to a commodity, but to the office the man holds, end quote. Horvat. So what then does the sale of labor power actually involve? Unfortunately, none of these ideas is discussed in terms of the class relation, let alone in terms of class struggle. One second. East European dissident theories. The, quote, mode of production, sui generis, end quote, theory, has also received support from various East European dissidents, beginning with the scholar who should perhaps be classed as the very first dissident of major importance, namely Gilas, a former vice president of Yugoslavia who left the League of Communists in 1954 after being stripped of his official posts. Gilas proceeds to develop the view that the Soviet-type systems were based on the rule of a class which was non-capitalist but still exploitative. The most useful passage of his seminal work, The New Class, published in 1957, are those where Gilas writes of the, quote, limit to exploitation, end quote. But unfortunately, Gilas fails to delve very deeply into the matter. Thus, his account of how slave labor had to be scrapped because it was proving too costly for the regime is all too brief. Gilas further mentions concealed unemployment, but considers concealed unemployment only in terms of inefficiency, not as a class relation amounting to paying workers to do nothing. Third, Gilas touches on how the system, quote, leads inevitably to lack of interest on the part of the actual producers, to low quality of output, bracket, and to, end bracket, a decline in real productivity, end quote. Gilas. But the lens through which Gilas examines the system is one marked, quote, dogmatism in the economy, end quote, rather than, quote, really existing class relations, end quote. Ultimately, even as Gilas recognizes that the working class is, quote, the class upon which production depends, end quote, Gilas forgets the primacy of social production relations and eventually reaches the view that, quote, in the communist system, economy has become concentrated politics. That is, politics plays an almost decisive role in the economy, end quote. Gilas. Footnote. One second. Where's that? That's the footnote number. Footnote 18. Shen Ergin later presents a similar view in the context of his portrayal of the Soviet system as a prime example of the, quote, revisionist mode of exploitation, end quote. Shen Ergin's view of the worker under such a system as a, quote, mere slave, end quote, however, echoes the opinions of Bruno Rizzi and James Burnham rather than those of the East European, quote, dissidents. It should perhaps be added that his brief consideration of the USSR serves principally as a backdrop to what he has to say about China, and he does not study the former country in any depth. The Soviet immigrant Voslensky writes even more starkly, even if at greater length, of the fundamentally, quote, political aims and basis of the ruling group, arguing throughout his book that the, quote, nomenclatura class, end quote, enjoys unlimited power. He suggests that the working class, although it produces surplus value, quote, has been plunged back into a system of extra economic forced labor as in the age of slavery or serfdom, or feudalism, end quote. Hence there is no class struggle. End footnote. By concentrating on politics and ideology, Gillas is consequently more denunciatory, especially of, quote, one-party rule, end quote, than Gillas is theoretically critical in a, quote, Marxist, end quote, sense. Footnote. Of marginal interest is the fact that the publication of the new class received backing from the CIA. Gillas has since renounced, quote, Marxism. More recently, Gillas has described the Soviet crisis, somewhat expectedly, in terms which reduced the Soviet crisis to a crisis of, quote, one-party rule, end quote. In this view, everyone outside the Communist Party of the Soviet Union has a need for democratic pluralism, end footnote. Koran and Modzelewski's open letter to the party, first published in Poland in 1965, represents an altogether more radical critique. The open letter to the party by Koran and Modzelewski is on this channel. Footnote. Although Koran and Modzelewski deny that the USSR and the East European countries were capitalist, Koran and Modzelewski nonetheless theorized the existence in those countries of both wage labor and capital accumulation, even if Koran and Modzelewski seem to portray a society that developed sui generis rather than just a system. Koran and Modzelewski still avoid writing explicitly of a new mode of production. Koran and Modzelewski's theory would thus appear to be rather confused. If Koran and Modzelewski had written under different political conditions, however, and if Koran and Modzelewski had written more on the world historical context of their subject matter, it is probable, we would argue, that Koran and Modzelewski would have adopted a, quote, capitalist theory. But since this point cannot be argued in the context of the present thesis, we have chosen instead to refrain from ascribing a theory to Koran and Modzelewski, which they themselves did not make explicit. End footnote. Being among the very few East European intellectuals even to call for a working class revolution, these two theorists, Koran and Modzelewski, undoubtedly stand out from other, quote, dissidents, end quote, in terms of the amount of attention Koran and Modzelewski pay to the position of the working class. Taking the view that the working class is exploited by a ruling class in the form of the central bureaucracy, Koran and Modzelewski argue that the form this exploitation takes is wage labor. In other words, the only productive force which the ruling class does not already own is labor power, which it is therefore forced to buy in block in return for wages. The goal of production is the accumulation of the surplus product on a correspondingly, quote, national, end quote, scale. Koran and Modzelewski proceed to relate the contradictions of the bureaucratic system, as manifested in economic crisis, to the class relations of production, arguing that, quote, production for the sake of production, end quote, means a tendency towards a disproportionate growth in Department 1, the means of production department. Kuran and Modzelewski give the view that the logic of the system is to restrict the growth of consumption. Consumption needs, meanwhile, grow regardless, owing to, quote, full employment, the development of an industrial civilization, and, an improvement in the general level of social culture, end quote. Kuran and Modzelewski. In the context of this contradiction, and unlike any of the, quote, Marxist, end quote, theorists considered so far, Kuran and Modzelewski describe workers' efforts to lower efficiency and product quality as amounting to a, quote, massive social initiative, end quote. Quote, like all social initiative, workers' efforts to lower efficiency and product quality is a conscious activity to realize the aims and interests of the people concerned, What we have here is, a contradiction between the class goal of the bureaucracy, production for production, and the interest of the basic groups who achieve the production, maximum consumption, In other words, it is a contradiction between the class goal of production and consumption, and it results from existing conditions, not from mismanagement, end quote. Kuran and Modzelewski. The problem, however, is that in Kuran and Modzelewski's conception of the working class as subject, Kuran and Modzelewski do not go far enough. When Kuran and Modzelewski come to discuss the nature of the, quote, social initiative, end quote, antagonistic to the bureaucracy, Kuran and Modzelewski fail to draw a clear enough line between the obstructiveness of managers and technocrats on one hand and that of the workers on the other. Moreover, Kuran and Modzelewski fail to spell out the fundamental point that sloppy work and upward pressure on wages are both forms of the same struggle. Less work and more pay both mean a lower rate of exploitation. These confusions ultimately lead Kuran and Modzelewski to adopt the, quote, underconsumptionist, end quote, view that the low level of consumption actually inhibits the growth of production. In arguing that the scarcity of consumer goods in relation to nominal wage growth creates a, quote, inflation barrier, end quote, and the danger of falling real wages, and therefore constitutes a major barrier to growth, Kuran and Modzelewski are neglecting two fundamental points. First, that the needs of the exploited are something imposed on the exploiters, to whom the needs of the exploited are simply costs. And second, that the, quote, crisis, end quote, is something imposed back on the working class in the interest of exploitative society. Rather than seeing the, quote, crisis, end quote, as a class, that is, class struggle determined relation, Kuran and Modzelewski prefer to view the, quote, crisis as a manifestation of a sort of, quote, decline, end quote, of production relations based on production for the sake of production. If Rakovsky's work is less radical than Kuran and Modzelewski's open letter, where the matter of class structure is concerned, it is rather more scientific than Gillas's new class. Footnote. Oh, there's two footnotes, actually, that I missed. If from a communist viewpoint, one has to remark upon a level of radicality in the open letter which was absent in the works of the other dissident intellectuals, and which in light of the author's anti-parliamentarism and class-based internationalism might well be described as revolutionary, it should also be pointed out that when the period of sustained and open mass struggle began in Poland, Kuran and Modzelewski changed camp completely. While Modzelewski was writing approvingly in the official press that, quote, the only role to which solidarity aspires is to be a recognized and respected social partner, end quote, Kuran put forward similarly nationalist ideas of a unity of interest between workers and rulers, and his role, alongside other leading figures in solidarity, in encouraging workers to end their strikes, made Kuran an active and direct opponent of working class struggle. See Simon 1982, that's probably Henri Simon actually. Whereas in 1965, Kuran had called for the arming of the working class. In 1981, Kuran even opposed a strike demanding the release of workers who had publicized secret government plans for a repression. See Simon, 1982. I think I have that piece, actually, but I'm not sure. It's an important piece, I think, in like the council communist tradition, Simon's work on Poland. End footnote. Next footnote. Mark Rakowski was the pseudonym of the two Hungarian writers Georgi Benc and János Kiss. End footnote. One second. Wikipedia says Georgi Benc lived from 1941 to 2006. Georgi Benc was a university professor, philosopher, dissident, and political consultant. In 1979, Georgi Benc was among the first Hungarians who criticized, together with Andrei Sakharov and others, the Soviet crackdown on the Czech Charter 77 signatories. Later, Georgi Benc was among the founding members of the International Helsinki Federation for Human Rights. Georgi Benc was founding editor-in-chief of the Budapesti Könyvzemla. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. And Wikipedia says János Kiss was born in 1943, so I guess he's still alive. János Kiss is a Hungarian philosopher in political science who served as the inaugural leader of the Liberal Alliance of Free Democrats, SZDSZ, from 1990 to 1991. János Kiss is considered to be the first leader of the Hungarian parliamentary opposition. End footnote. Or back to the text. Like Gilas, though, Rakowski, who again is Benc and Kiss, that's their pseudonym, like Gilas, though, Rakowski shows little interest in the working class as a, quote, really existing, end quote, subjective class force. Quote, the closer the two systems, bracket, quote, capitalist and bracket, quote, Soviet type, end bracket, resemble each other at the level of the everyday life of the working class, the more difficult it is to avoid asking the question, why has the working class succeeded in having an organized influence on its conditions of life in only one of the two systems? Why is it only Western capitalism that has a workers' movement, whether reformist or revolutionary? There can be no doubt that this is the key question for every Marxism, ... end quote, Rakowski. In fact, of course, this is the, quote, key question, end quote, only for those, quote, Marxisms, end quote, which not fully espouse the view that the history of class societies is the history of class struggles, and it reveals an assumption that the present representation of the working class by the unions in the left is the same thing as the working class, quote, movement, end quote, itself. Consequently, even as Rakowski accepts that changes in the situation of the working class are difficult to interpret, Rakowski keeps to the view that workers' resistance in the Soviet-type countries is confined to the level of, quote, individual behavior, end quote. And, like so many others, once Rakowski has mentioned such behavior, Rakowski fails to ask what the contradictory forces are which determine it. All the same, Rakowski does cautiously predict a growth in the, quote, relative autonomy of the oppressed class, end quote, even if on the basis of a spread of intellectual nonconformism, as well as on the basis of an objectively strengthened position of the workers' household. Since Rakowski links the latter factor to a growth in the strength of the individual worker's position in the labor market, it would be unfair to say that Rakowski neglects to consider class relations, given that Rakowski further predicts that any future political crisis will also give greater scope to the workers. There is clearly a level at which Rakovsky seems to describe fairly accurately the events which took place at the end of the 1980s. But theory would be more than description, and it is worth pointing out the theoretical weakness of his approach. Namely, his drawing of a sharp distinction between, on the one hand, development centered around the objective strength of the working class, benefiting, according to Rakovsky, from the ideological assistance supposedly offered it by the lower ranks of the intellectuals, and, on the other, the economic collapse of the system, which on the contrary he does not see as a possibility. The final contribution to the dissident oeuvre requiring consideration is the work co-authored by Feher, Heller, and Marcus, published in 1983. Footnote. Although in the foreword the authors claim collective responsibility for each of the book's three parts, and note that each was the product of repeated discussion, they nonetheless identify a main author in each case. Since the theoretical approach varies considerably, this is of more than bibliographical significance. Thus, Heller writes in Part 2 on questions of, quote, legitimation, ideology, and consent, demonstrates little or no concern for underlying questions concerning the nature of the political economy, and for this, Heller's analysis is hardly very, quote, Marxist, end quote, at all, a weakness which for us is especially disappointing in view of the profundity and radicality of her earlier work on need, published in 1974. In Part 3, meanwhile, despite the fact that he ascribes a high level of significance to the categories of the rational and irrational, Feher undoubtedly shows a somewhat greater interest in the contradictions of the production relations, including those of the material relations between workers and rulers. It is, however, Marcus, the author of Part 1, whose contribution is the least informed by Weberianism and the most by, quote, Marxism, even if Weberianism is still highly evident. Whilst in the main text we follow the author's wishes by assuming joint authorship, in the references we take account of the variation by citing each author individually. End footnote. I'm not really finding anything for Feher. Looks like there's an obituary for him with Dissent magazine, but it doesn't really go into anything. Heller, of course, is referring to Agnes Heller. Agnes Heller lived from 1924 to 2019 and was a Hungarian philosopher and lecturer. Agnes Heller was a core member of the Budapest School Philosophical Forum in the 1960s and later taught political theory for 25 years at the New School for Social Research in New York City. Agnes Heller lived, wrote, and lectured in Budapest. And then finally, Georgi Marcus lived from 1934 to 2016. Georgi Marcus was a Hungarian philosopher belonging to the small circle of critical theorists closely associated with Georg Lukács, and usually referred to as the Budapest School. End footnote. Noting that the, quote, or back to the text, noting that the, quote, planning, end quote, process in Soviet-type economies is in fact a, quote, multi-level bargaining process, end quote, among members of the, quote, apparatus, end quote. Or, as it is later presented, a, quote, very complicated process of semi-institutionalized competition, between the various horizontally and vertically articulated bureaucracies, end quote. Feher, Heller, and Marcus advocate the idea that the nationalized means of production are the property of the, quote, apparatus, and not as a, quote, collective, but rather as a, quote, corporation. Thus the, quote, members of the apparatus, whilst competing among themselves, do not function as members of a capitalist-type ruling class, wherein their own individual interests coincide in any important way with their interests as a collective, but rather as, quote, trustees, end quote, as, quote, representatives of the institutional interests of the apparatus as a corporate entity, end quote. Feher, Heller, and Marcus. In this view, since if every bureaucrat were promoted simultaneously, quote, there would be no advance at all, end quote, bureaucratic interest is, quote, non-additive, end quote. The interest or, quote, goal of the corporation, meanwhile, is defined as the, quote, maximization of the material means under the direct control of the apparatus, end quote. Given the tendency of the bureaucratic apparatus to expand and the absence of a non-bureaucratic mechanism which can bring individual bureaucratic interest into, quote, correspondence, end quote, with the corporate interest, the result is structural, quote, economic irrationality, end quote. Although Feher, Heller, and Marcus never clearly define what membership of the bureaucratic apparatus consists of, they accept that the material basis of, quote, overall social domination, end quote, is the appropriation of a surplus. But insofar as the interest of the individual bureaucrat is portrayed as operating most importantly in terms of the bureaucracy itself, it is hardly likely that this appropriation can be properly dealt with as a relation of production continuously imposed on the workers as a condition of their labor. And indeed, the very recognition of the fundamental role of surplus appropriation is surrounded with numerous qualifications. Thus, the authors reject any, quote, reduction, end quote, of the social structure to one of class dichotomy and state that it is not determined by a single principal cause. Quote, be it monopolization of social power, appropriation of social surplus, or whatever, end quote. Alternatively, the appropriation of the surplus and the disposition over the surplus comprise, quote, only the material foundation and economic component, end quote, of the apparatus's, quote, monopolistic appropriation of all means of social organization and discourse, end quote. The position appears best, if belaboredly, in their statement that the, quote, antagonism between the corporate ruling group and the rest of society, end quote, is, quote, created, given substance, and perpetuated, end quote, by the, quote, suppression of all group interest and of civil society, end quote. The USSR is then a, quote, political society, end quote. Heller, Feher, and Marcus. And since modernity, practicality, and the presumed inevitability of scarcity supposedly necessitate the existence of either market or privilege, Marcus, the only realistic alternative to a Soviet-style, quote, dictatorship over needs, end quote, would appear to be the introduction of a market. Economic rationality could then flourish, and the market's, quote, spontaneous effects, end quote, could be, quote, counteracted, end quote, by self-management and political democracy. See Marcus, 1983, and Feher, 1983. This raising of Soviet-type bureaucracy to almost archetypal status as the irrational not market corresponds to a crucial lack of grasp of the underlying social function of the bureaucratic system, and indeed also of the market, in relation to the surplus. Such a weakness appears most starkly in the author's avowal that, quote, the members of the apparatus are not constrained to act in a definite way by the position the members of the apparatus occupy in the structure of social reproduction. The members of the apparatus have to follow consciously the rules and objectives preset by the apparatus. End quote. Marxist, 1983. What is missed here is that it is precisely the position in terms of social reproduction which determines the fundamental role of any social agency. If the first part of this statement is clearly nonsensical, however, the second is similarly obstructive of a clear analysis of the power relation between workers and exploiters. Thus, the theory of the, quote, corporation, end quote, slides all too easily into talk of the, quote, will of the sovereign, end quote, defined, depending on the period, as that of the Bolshevik, quote, aristocrats, the, quote, autocrat, Stalin, or the Communist Party of the Soviet Union's, quote, oligarchs. See Heller, 1983. But the type of distinction between the political and the economic, which is central to the methodology, does not merely hinder the formulation of a critical understanding of the state. The type of distinction between the political and the economic, which is central to the methodology, also makes the possibility extremely remote of reaching a profound understanding of the struggle over the division of the social product. Admittedly, the authors do note that workers resist the imposition of discipline and consequently maintain some sort of, quote, negative control over their work. But little is made of this, and rather than being seen as a major problem for the rulers, it is portrayed largely as a product of the irrationalities of the bureaucratic system. Indeed, it is even presented as something which automatically backfires on the workers, by leading to wage cuts which workers are then led to compensate for by earning extra money working on the side. As we shall see below in Chapter 7, though, this type of analysis is not simply superficial, it is factually wrong. And the assumption that wages in a given workplace are administratively preset and then simply handed over, at no time being the object of, quote, legitimate, end quote, bargaining, only illustrates further the author's lack of interest in how it actually comes about that workers receive such and such an amount of money in return for work of such and such a kind and quality. Footnote. It appears that I missed a footnote, so I'll read the footnote I missed and the one that I didn't. Such statements are hardly rare in, quote, social science. The general rule being that, quote, the economic is left undefined. Nonetheless, the view that society's material foundation is only one of society's material foundation is only one of its, quote, components, end quote, is virtually the defining characteristic of bourgeois empiricism. The absence of radicality is clear once it is understood that the idea of the economic being a, quote, facet or, quote, component of the social, with the political being another and the culture another, speaks more of the fragmentation of capitalist academia over the past 2 centuries than of the nature of social reproduction in an exploitative society. End footnote. Footnote. The statement that, quote, in conditions where employees have no right to autonomous professional or trade organizations, this indirect and spontaneous resistance can have only mild modifying effects, end quote, Marcus, may perhaps be only borderline absurd, but it surely calls for no great counter-argument when the authors omit to provide any argument in favor of it, end footnote. Questions, for example, of the significance of labor hoarding and the payment of bonuses are not even broached. Nonetheless, this lack of substantial consideration of the relations at the point of production does not prevent Feher, Heller, and Marcus from stating that, quote, the basic restrictions on the economic power of the apparatus emerge not in the sphere of production proper, end quote, but rather in the sphere of individual workers' choices as to what to consume and to a certain extent where to work. See Marcus 1983, page 87. Footnote. We would add that even the interest which these, quote, market socialists, end quote, show in workers' consumption choices remains superficial, insofar as these market socialists take the view, so simplistic for most bourgeois economists, that it is a, quote, truism, end quote, that, quote, people always want something more of everything, end quote. Feher. End footnote. But we note that even here the root of the resultant problems would seem to be the contradictions inherent in the totalizing bureaucratic tendency, or, quote, will, to, quote, internalize such, quote, externalities, rather than the effect of actual worker struggle. In the final analysis, the inadequate consideration of the relations between workers and exploiters corresponds well to the author's summary view that, quote, abstractly speaking, it is not in the interest of any government to keep that government's population artificially indigent, ... But whereas for the ruling classes in capitalism, abundance for the wage earners, bracket sick, and bracket, is in itself indifferent, ... and can never be the source of profit, bracket, not for the capitalist class as a whole, Neil C. Fernandez, end bracket. It is not so with dictatorship over needs, an anti-capitalist enterprise. The latter was designed and planned as a negation of its opponent. As a result, the expansion of the individual or group needs system, bracket, and bracket, its variability, ... would mean the resurrection of precisely that individual on whose forced obedience, frugality, and built-in servility alone the evidence of the anti-capitalist dictatorship can rest, end quote. Friedrich Feher. In the meantime, quote, without a free social articulation of needs, there can be no social rationality, bracket, and bracket. This means that it is impossible for the regime to transcend the extensive period of economy and effect the transition to the intensive period of economy, end quote. Thus it is held that the, quote, restrictions, end quote, which workers' choices in accordance with their needs actually do manage to force upon the, quote, corporation, end quote, principally the ones they make as consumers, tend to push most of all towards the reintroduction of the market in what in effect would be the, quote, general interest, end quote, of the population. The struggle involved in social reproduction over the division of the product into wage goods on one side and surplus on the other is not held to be a factor of any major political economic significance. Later, quote, collectivist, end quote, theories. If the, quote, bureaucratic collectivist, end quote, theories of the Stalin period, especially of those of Bruno Ricci and James Burnham, were in many ways rather simplistic, the newer version put forward in the 1970s was, despite the new bureaucratic collectivist theory's weaknesses, undoubtedly is somewhat more nuanced. The reason for this is quite straightforward. Having a better vantage point from which to view Soviet economic problems, not to mention access to Eastern European theoretical works such as Kuran and Mogilevsky's Open Letter to the Party, Carlo and Fathom and Machover were much more interested than their, quote, collectivist, end quote, forebears in discussing Soviet society's contradictions. I have several pieces by Antonio Carlo. I don't have anything by Fathom and Machover. One second. Not finding anything for Fathom. Looking for Machover. Moshe Machover is a mathematician, philosopher, and socialist activist noted for his writings against Zionism, born to a Jewish family in Tel Aviv, then part of the British Mandate of Palestine. Machover moved to Britain in 1968, where he became a naturalized citizen. He was a founder of Matt's Pen, the Israeli socialist organization, in 1962. He was part of a... What journal did he write part of? There was a journal that was in UK, I'm pretty sure, that he was a part of. Is he part of Big Flame? No, doesn't look like it. Oh, God damn it. Anyway. No. Sorry. It was probably annoying to just hear me punch away at my keyboard. Anyway, in his article on the, quote, socioeconomic nature of the USSR, which will be on this channel, is slated to be up on this channel, Carlos centers his attention on one contradiction in particular, namely that which exists between the forces and relations of production. This contradiction he finds expressed in three ways: the disproportion between the capital goods and consumer goods sectors, the impossibility of total coordination, and the low level of labor productivity. Considering the first of these problems, Carlo argues that unlike in, quote, capitalism, where, quote, if machines for producing shoes are built, it will sooner or later be necessary to produce shoes, end quote. The growth in the Soviet primary sector has, quote, assumed pathological dimensions that threaten the very foundations of development, end quote. Footnote. Quote, primary sector, end quote, is used here to denote the production of means of production, end footnote. Back to the text. Under, quote, capitalism, consumption levels have risen due to an increase in absolute wages, the appearance of a sizable tertiary sector, and the expansion of credit. But under Soviet, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, they have stayed low. As a result, the system is in trouble. This trouble is so severe that ever since 1965, Soviet, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote, has found itself gradually metamorphosing into capitalism. And by arguing in this way, Carlo is repeating the mistake made by Kuran and Mogilevsky, namely the assumption that consumer growth necessarily helps an exploitative system by providing demand. Footnote. By making use in the Soviet context of a category remarkably similar to the capitalist category of, quote, demand, It would seem that Carlo is leading his theory of the non-capitalist nature of the society onto very weak ground. End footnote. In fact, of course, producing shoes simply to sell to the workers is not in itself beneficial to any group of exploiters, since what the working class consumes is derived from the necessary part of the product, whereas the exploiters are only interested in the surplus. An increase in workers' consumption can only benefit the exploiters if it buys or enables a large enough growth in productivity. When Carlo addresses the second problem, in Carlo's terms continue to vary between the quote classist and the quote non-classist. In response to the question, quote, why can't the system be planned, end quote, Antonio Carlo begins by stating that working class opposition has asserted working class opposition's self in the plan execution phase ever since the system came into existence, but follows this by considering technical problems of calculation and forecasting. Antonio Carlo then suggests that the introduction of advanced techniques of computerized surveillance would bring its own problems, namely an increase in waste combined with the possibility of explosive opposition from managers, workers, and farmers. What has happened here is that the earlier mention of workers' opposition in connection with the prevention of bureaucratic planning, after being followed with a discussion of mere technical problems, has ended up being considered in purely hypothetical and cross-class terms of a, quote, Orwellian, end quote, future. Footnote. The reference to, quote, Orwellian controls is Carlo's own. End footnote. The same lack of theoretical depth is evident when Carlo comes to consider the third aspect of the contradiction, namely labor productivity as a specific phenomenon, in stating that it is by means of lower productivity levels that, quote, the workers' rejection of the system expresses itself, end quote. Carlo is going further than previous, quote, Marxists, end quote. But even so, he ultimately does little more than to affirm what is obvious. Workers are disinclined to work well just so that bureaucrats can get better off. Meanwhile, even though Antonio Carlo identifies the system's acceptance of quote, moderate work rhythm, end quote, as being a concession to the working class that, quote, is not exceptional but organic and normal, end quote, Antonio Carlo's political approach demands that Antonio Carlo view the frustration of productivity as, quote, negative, as well as, quote, positive in terms of the objective interests of the workers, since the frustration of productivity lowers the chances of winning the, quote, winning, quote, the, quote, peaceful coexistence, end quote, race, end quote, Antonio Carlo. If the strength of Antonio Carlo's work is that, unlike the earlier, quote, collectivist, end quote, Antonio Carlo brings into his understanding of the problem of the system a clear recognition of the importance of working class opposition. Its weakness is that, like Koran and Mogilevsky, he fails to do so in a resolute enough manner. At best, his approach leads to an empiricism where issues of actual class antagonism appear but are not given a central place. At worst, Carlo loses sight of exactly what is a problem for whom, for which class. Through confusion, Carlo obscures exploitative society's basic contradiction, namely that which exists between the most important, quote, productive force, end quote, the proletariat, and the most important, quote, relation of production, end quote, the, quote, system, end quote, as a whole. Moreover, his implicit identification of the forces of production, which the material means of production, combined with his explicit taking of sides in the, quote, peaceful coexistence, end quote, race, end quote, shows an undeniable basic accommodation with the official ideology of the system Antonio Carlo is endeavoring to criticize. Footnote. This is also evident in Carlo's support for Mao's dictatorship in China, which prevents Carlo from seriously envisaging what kind of society revolutionary workers might conceivably want instead of the USSR. In Carlo's view, quote, the Chinese model has proved that the bureaucratic road is not always inevitable, end quote. Antonio Carlo, end footnote. In a later text concerning bureaucratic collectivism's crisis, Carlo similarly fails to adequately clear, quote, class lines, end quote, arguing that Soviet growth under the bureaucratic collectivist system had to remain, quote, essentially, end quote, extensive. He describes some of the problems faced by the bureaucracy in trying to develop efficiency. Thus, he shows how military technology cannot be transferred to the civilian economy as in the bourgeois countries, owing to high cost and the structural innovation problem, and how buying technology abroad is also no real solution, because sooner or later, quote, the economy as a whole, end quote, will have to bear the cost. Before reaching a far too superficial definition of crisis as, quote, a difficulty in achieving the most important and central ends of the plan, end quote, Antonio Carlo does explain his ideas in terms of class antagonism, but Antonio Carlo fails to trace the development of this class antagonism as an actual rapport de force, seeing class antagonism rather as a mere underlying fact. Hence, Antonio Carlo totally rejects the idea that, quote, Russian, end quote, workers are, quote, opposed to an increase in the production of consumer goods, since this would mean an increase in their working load, end quote. On the grounds that the black market and the, quote, consumer boycott, end quote, constrained saving, shows that worker consumers, quote, do not readily accept the system's delivery of consumer goods, end quote. Here, Antonio Carlo is drastically missing the point, which is that the reason why the system is incapable of establishing a new deal of, quote, more goods for harder work, end quote, is that workers' resistance to work, not just in consumer goods production, is too strong. If workers have an objection to, quote, more goods, end quote, workers are nonetheless not prepared to work harder to get them. Carlo's only counter-argument here, namely that the kolkhozniks work hard on their private plots and that they are in no way, quote, biologically different, end quote, from other workers, fails to hold, since the plots Antonio Carlo mentions amount to privately owned productive forces which are clearly unavailable to the majority of the proletariat. Carlo rightly stresses that higher quality production is impossible without workers' collaboration, but rather than explaining the root cause of the problem which the bureaucracy faces in achieving such a deal, Antonio Carlo simply blames the bureaucracy. Carlo rightly stresses that higher quality production is impossible without workers' collaboration, but rather than explain the root cause of the problems which the bureaucracy faces in achieving such a deal, he simply blames them on the, quote, system, which is, quote, organically antagonistic, end quote. Since he fails to identify the actual forms this antagonism takes, Antonio Carlo's view of this antagonism remains highly abstract. Carlo's work 10 years later on the, quote, contradictions of perestroika, end quote, marks little theoretical advance and may even be considered a move backwards, failing to mention class antagonism or resilience even as one underlying cause of crisis among many. Antonio Carlo focuses still more clearly upon the systemic bias against technological innovation as the prime determining factor. Consumer sector weaknesses and future unemployment and underdevelopment are understood solely on this basis. A, quote, collectivist, end quote, view of the USSR has also been presented by Fantham and Mackover. A quote collectivist view of the USSR has also been presented by Fantham and Machover, who state in a one-off pamphlet of 1979 that conditions prevailing in the, quote, second world, together with those established or emerging in parts of the, quote, third world, justify reference to a new mode of production running, quote, parallel to capitalism, end quote. This, quote, state collectivist, end quote, mode of production, Fantham and Machover see as fulfilling a precise, quote, historical role, end quote, namely that of developing the productive forces and creating an industrial infrastructure wherever capitalism proves incapable of doing so to its global decline. This is thus a repetition, with slight alterations, of the thesis first argued by Carlo. Footnote, quote, bureaucratic collectivism can, arise naturally and develop only in underdeveloped countries, end quote. Carlo. Bureaucratic collectivism can arise from the, quote, degeneration, end quote, of a, quote, socialist revolution. Excuse me, I need to repeat that whole thing, I'm confusing myself. Quote, bureaucratic collectivism can arise naturally and develop only in underdeveloped countries, end quote. Or, bureaucratic collectivism can arise from the, quote, degeneration of a, quote, socialist revolution, end quote. Carlo gives only one example of the latter, namely Russia, but even in that case he underlines relative economic backwardness as a factor. Leaving aside their mention of decline, then, a point which Fantham and Machover do not develop, we see that their disagreement with Carlo appears to be limited to specific examples such as China and Egypt. Fantham and Machover see these countries as respectively, quote, state collectivist, end quote, and, quote, state capitalist, end quote. The latter views them as respectively, quote, transitional to socialism, end quote, and, quote, bureaucratic collectivist, end quote. End footnote. Fantham and Machover's originality lies in the extent to which Fantham and Machover stress that Soviet conditions conform to a, quote, generally applicable model, end quote, of a mode of production bound to experience both, quote, progress and eventual, quote, decline. Trotsky's view of necessary instability is emphatically rejected. Footnote. For comparison, see Trotsky, 1939a. End footnote. In relation to the working class, the implications of such an alternative, quote, orthodox Marxist, end quote, approach would thus seem clear. Under the heading, quote, the historically progressive stages of the system, end quote, Fantham and Machover quote Koran and Modzelewski on how from 1945 to 1960, quote, the achievements of Polish industrialization, meant the realization of a general social interest, end quote. And they proceed to imply that class antagonism during that period was of little significance. In the next section entitled, quote, the period of crisis, end quote, Koran and Modzelewski point to the chronic problems experienced by the Soviet elite and the consequent ineffectiveness of, quote, planning, end quote, as shown by Tikhtin. The idea here would appear quite straightforward, namely that in the, quote, progressive, end quote, phase of, quote, state collectivism, end quote, that is, during extensive industrialization, workers participate, but once that phase comes to an end, workers stop. Having earlier promised, though, that much of their discussion will revolve around the USSR, Fantham and Machover stop short of explicitly applying this thesis to that country. Instead, examples, as they see them, of, quote, participation and, quote, working class identification with the system, end quote, are taken from elsewhere, and the USSR is used as the exclusive source of examples of antagonism, such as resistant labor rigidity and avoidance of hard work. Footnote. The only exception is a one-sentence reference to working class organizations in Poland. End footnote. All in all, what Fantham and Machover have to say about the Soviet working class is so confused that it does not lend itself to being summarized in coherent fashion. On the one hand, Soviet, quote, state collectivism, end quote, is seen as, quote, progressive, in relation to the capitalist conditions which pertained prior to 1917, and Kuran and Mogilevsky are quoted as drawing a link between the mode of production's, quote, progressive, end quote, phase and genuine working class participation. On the other, Ticktin is referred to approvingly as demonstrating the low quality of work which has been there for as long as the system itself. Admittedly, after quoting the open letter, Fantham and Machover do say that the contradictions may take very different forms and proceed at a very different pace outside Poland, but the gap between, on one hand, Kuran and Mogilevsky's view, as generalized here, and, on the other, Ticktin's view as quoted, would seem logically unbridgeable. For the rest, one is presented with a series of points which are left theoretically unconnected. The working class suffers because consumption levels are, quote, comparatively, end quote, low. Comparative to what? But on the other hand, employment is full, which means that dismissal is rare and productivity is, quote, sticky upwards, end quote. The only effective sanction against the working class is, quote, repressive administrative control, end quote. But at the same time, there is a, quote, high degree of ideological control, bracket, which is, end bracket, extended even more strongly than in advanced capitalism through the media, education, and the family, end quote. Apparently in absolute contradiction with this starting point, however, is asserted in the very next sentence that, quote, state collectivism shares with all non-capitalist class systems a relative transparency of exploitation and oppression, end quote. Ultimately, are left with little more of substance than two basic points. First, low productivity conflicts with the bureaucrats' need to accumulate. Second, there are no, quote, independent, end quote, trade unions. New section. Recent, quote, mode of production, end quote, theory. One second. The most recent contribution to merit consideration is that made by Clark. Footnote. Omitting to theorize struggle, Roland has done little more than to state that full employment and the labor shortage, against a background of alienation, have led to poor discipline, nor need Bayer's recent work on the, quote, party-controlled, end quote, partitique mode of production of 1992 be considered, since no more is said about the actual class relation other than that it is exploitative and non-capitalist. Meanwhile, Lefebvre, who presents an analysis of a mode of production which he prefers to term, quote, statist, similarly omits to focus on the contradictions of class relations in the specific context of the USSR. It is undoubtedly the base that Burawoy, I don't know how to say his name, I think it might be Burawoy, not sure, has produced collaborative work, which from a Marxist perspective is comparatively of much greater interest insofar as he analyzes in some detail the shop floor effects and non-effects of post-1991 economic reform attempts in two specific Russian enterprises. See Burawoy and Henley, 1992, Burawoy and Krotov, 1992. But our focus here is primarily on theoretical views of the political-economic nature of the economic system during the preceding Soviet period, and in particular on the way such views have been related to overall conceptions of the conditions and activity of the working class as a system. And in this connection, it is clear that Burawoy follows Conrad and Zeleny, 1979, in that even while he uses elements of Marxian terminology, he adopts an approach which is primarily Weberian. Thus, in terms of a view of the nature of the Soviet system, his theorization has resolved principally around the construction of a, quote, ideal type of, quote, state socialism, now ostensibly being replaced by one of, quote, merchant capitalism, end quote. See Burawoy and Krotov, 1992. He does, of course, utilize a concept of, quote, workers' control, end quote, of the labor process, but as he and Krotov acknowledge, this is largely derived from the work of Connor and Ticktin. See chapters 4 and 6 below, respectively. chapters 4 above and chapter 6 below, respectively, and explained in terms of the, quote, full employment constraint, end quote, theorized by Granick. Moreover, whilst it would be unfair to suggest that Burawoy omits to relate this concept to a consideration of workers' struggle, for in places Burawoy does indeed do precisely this. The context in which Burawoy does so is solely that of the period of, quote, transition, end quote, since 1991, and that is not our concern here. End footnote. Though in 1990, Clark argues the McCaivist view that, quote, the social base of state socialism, bracket, i.e. Soviet society, end bracket, lies in the stratum of intellectual workers, bracket, such as, end bracket, managers, administrators, scientists, technicians, engineers, social workers, and teachers, end quote. Clark. By 1992, Clark has switched his allegiance to the view that Soviet society was based instead on the material relations of production. Footnote. On Mahaisky, see Average 1965, Schatz 1967 and 1989. For a similar perspective, see Conrad and Zelenyi 1979. End footnote. But unfortunately, the theoretical underpinning of Clark's new view of the, quote, Soviet mode of production, end quote, appears to be highly confused. Thus, for Clark, quote, the Soviet system was based on a form of wage labor, but the Soviet system was not based on social relations of capitalist production, end quote. Clark clearly believes that the sale of workers' labor power does not necessarily imply the existence of the category of abstract labor. Since Clark has not actually argued for this view, it is sufficient merely to observe that this would necessitate a major and definition-based revision of Marx's categories, which is yet to appear. Two further positions will serve to demonstrate Clark's confusion even more sharply. First, Clark's statement that the, quote, basis of the Soviet enterprise was not capital, but the productive activity of the labor collective, end quote. And a second, Clark's view that, quote, the surplus was appropriated from the direct producers in kind, end quote. Both are used to illustrate the non-capitalist nature of the system, but insofar as they apply equally well to the capitalism described by Marx, both fail. Footnote. This appropriation of the surplus in Naturalia is cited in the same context by Feher, Heller, and Marcus. If the argument is assumed to be non-circular, that is, not simply that the surplus is appropriated merely in kind, because the surplus takes a form which is not capital, the implication is surely that the category of capital can be understood without the context of social reproduction, investment, and accumulation. That is, simply as a form taken by each individual enterprise's, quote, surplus output, end quote, alternative or, quote, extra, end quote, to its material form. This is hardly compatible with a profound grasp of the nature of capitalist political economy. End footnote. In the absence of coherent definitions, Clark's assertion that, quote, capital did not exist in Russia, end quote, and that economic transactions were, quote, essentially non-monetary, end quote, remain insupportable. It is notable, however, that Clark does not go so as far as positing a non-capitalist mode of production based not only upon wage labor but also upon the need to accumulate the material productive forces. Instead, quote, the task of the enterprise administration was not to secure the expanded reproduction of capital, but the expanded reproduction of the labor collective. Any profits, bracket, sic, end bracket, which remained to the enterprise, once the enterprise had met met its obligations, were not appropriated as capital, but were generally spent on improving the working and social conditions of the labor collective, end quote. Clark. Certainly, production was not, quote, subordinate, end quote, to the needs of the, quote, collective. Indeed, the needs of the collective were, quote, subordinated, end quote, to the production and appropriation of a surplus. But what in Clark's view determined production was not any need of the system to expand the social product, but rather the system's, quote, need to secure the expanded reproduction of the labor collective, end quote. However much negotiation took place between enterprise and the center, there was thus a clear correspondence between the, quote, task of the enterprise managers and the needs of the system. The main aim of both sets of interest opposed to those of the workers was to expand the size of the working class. Clark proceeds to state in more, quote, classical, end quote, fashion that, quote, the development of the forces of production was constrained by the exploitative social relations of production, and it was this specific contradiction that underpinned the collapse of the administered command system, end quote. Clark. Two criticisms should be made of this view. First, the expansion of the working class, which Clark identifies as, quote, determinant, end quote, of production, would seem very clearly to constitute one type of development of the forces of production. Thus, while demographic factors are important, it is hard to see which production relations might have constrained such development. Second, if Clark is right, there would seem to be immense problems in identifying the, quote, irrationality, end quote, of the system in the difficulty it faced in developing productive forces in general. For Clark, the system's nature and dynamic were determined by the need to expand the labor collective, not the other productive forces, whose growth would seem to have been peripheral, or at most a byproduct of higher employment figures. In what terms, then, can the failure to produce a peripheral effect appear, quote, irrational, end quote, let alone critical? The answer could lie either with the externalities or with some abstract, quote, law of historical progress, end quote, derived elsewhere than from a theory of Soviet reality. But once again, Clark does not follow the theory through this far. A year later, in 1993, Clark changes to a third view. Not only does Clark now refer to, quote, Soviet production, rather than to a Soviet, quote, mode of production, end quote. 1993. Clark also moves away from Clark's previous position on the need of the system to expand the, quote, labor collective, end quote. The aim of production is now seen simply as the provision of surplus use values to satisfy, quote, the Politburo and the military, end quote, and the, quote, specific form of exploitation, end quote, is associated with the effort of the center to extort as such a surplus by maintaining control over supplies. In seeking to analyze the contradictions inherent in such a model, Clark then describes how, since the managers are not subject to the law of value, the manager's main problem is not that of controlling the labor process, but precisely that of acquiring the supplies over whose allocation the center retains administrative control. As a consequence, in terms of the control of the production process, the workers are allowed substantial leeway. The workers' work might be subject to intensification, but how the workers' work remains largely unsubject to external control. The question now arises of the form actually taken by the workers' control over the labor process. This control which is considered to contradict the interests of the rulers. Unfortunately, though, this is a question to which Clark fails to give an adequate answer. Somewhat confusedly, Clark asserts that, quote, the fact that Soviet workers had a high degree of control over the way in which Soviet workers produced, bracket, i.e. over the labor process, Neil C. Fernandez, end bracket, does not mean that Soviet workers had power. Workers could try to escape from their oppression in individual ways, in the form of absenteeism, labor turnover, alcoholism, and poor, quote, discipline and, quote, motivation, but Soviet workers had little possibility of collective resistance, end quote. Clark. But Clark adds that, quote, the limits of workers' power were set by the norms and targets handed down from above, end quote. Clark. These two statements clearly contradict each other. Moreover, in analyzing the class relations which correspond to the Soviet system, Clark concentrates primarily on the limits imposed on workers' power, which Clark sees as enforced by means of piece rates, stratification, union-administered benefits, and the enterprise-level labor surplus. Footnote, quote, labor surplus, end quote, is Clark's term for hoarded, quote, auxiliary, end quote, labor, which was largely unskilled, end footnote. What Clark does not theorize is the actual assertion of this power in course of struggle. Indeed, where Clark does not deny that the Soviet workers had any power, Clark clearly implies that Soviet workers managed to acquire some power without struggling for that power, as a sort of byproduct of the nature of the system. Despite Clark's interest in the workers' struggles, which have unfolded since 1989, Clark seeks to explain the causes of the crisis of the system in terms which are remarkably non-classist. Clark begins by criticizing the Soviet reformist view, associated with Gorbachev and others, that the administrative command system had proven, quote, well adapted to the economic priorities of heavy industrialization in the 1930s, end quote, but by the 1980s had become increasingly irrational. For Clark, quote, the system was economically irrational from the system's inception. We cannot explain the crisis of the system by the system's economic irrationality alone. If the system was economically irrational from the system's inception, we cannot explain the crisis of the system by the system's economic irrationality alone. The system did not meet the needs of the Soviet people in the 1980s, but the system had not met the needs of the Soviet people in the 1930s. And it was never designed to meet their needs. The system was designed to meet the political needs of the nomenklatura, ... The crisis arose because the mechanisms which had kept a grotesquely repressive, exploitative, and inefficient system going, despite its irrationality for almost 60 years, had reached their limits, end quote. Clark. The analysis here would seem to be largely rhetorical. It should be noted, for example, that the term, quote, nomenklatura, end quote, which might be applied to everyone from the patriarch to a provincial newspaper editor, but not to the members of the Politburo, appears highly inappropriate. In addition, it is fairly obvious that Stalinist industrialization did prove to be, quote, rational in terms of the goals Stalin famously ascribed to it in 1931, namely, rapid enough economic development within 10 years to permit the avoidance of outright military destruction. See Macaulay, 1981. Even if Clark goes on to specify that by the 1960s, it was the, quote, strategy, end quote, of extensive development which was beginning to reach, quote, reach its limits, end quote. Clark approaches only in passing the questions of what these limits were and how these limits came to be reached. The problem would simply be the continuing irrationality of the system, as manifested by the exhaustion of easily exploitable resources and by the, quote, neglect of the reproduction of the technical, natural, and human forces of production, end quote. Low levels of workers' motivation are now brought in as one result, among others, of the low level of, quote, reproductive investment, end quote, in general. The sloppiness of this analysis is apparent once it is remembered that extensive growth is by definition precisely not dependent upon the reproduction of existing resources, but upon the mustering of new resources, and that the USSR can hardly be said to have exhausted the massive reserves of coal, oil, uranium, etc., which are so important to the USSR's economy. See, for example, IMF et al., 1991. Seeing high military spending as the main contingent factor threatening to turn stagnation into economic collapse, Clark is ultimately led to stress that the, quote, timing, end quote, of the crisis was determined not by internal factors at all, but by, quote, the relationship between the Soviet system and international capitalism, end quote. Clark then proceeds to discuss the effects of changes in the international terms of trade, especially the price of oil. In this view, the oil price rise provided an important breathing space after 1973, but the subsequent fall, together with the global debt mountain and the rising grain prices, precipitated the onset of full-scale crisis in the late 1980s. What Clark notably fails to discuss is the relationship between the underlying causes, either of the crisis itself or of its timing, to the specific relation of the workers to the labor process. And, as if to underline this omission, Clark states clearly, but without argument, that the crisis was in fact not one of surplus production at all, but simply one of, quote, surplus appropriation, end quote, and distribution. Clark's desire to theorize the relation between the, quote, development of class struggles over the social relations of production, end quote, and the, quote, dynamics of the transformation of the Soviet mode of production, end quote, remains necessarily unarmed. Clark may have produced a useful analysis of the problems of privatization and co-written informative accounts of the development of the, quote, workers' movement, end quote, since 1989, but since he has a theory neither of the class struggle in the previous period nor of the accumulation of the productive forces, he cannot really relate class struggle to crisis in any profound historical or dynamic way. Above all, this would demand a preliminary recognition of the working class as a historical subject with, quote, radical chains, end quote, and a quest to understand its self-assertion as the tendential negation of the existing order. See Marx, 1984. Whilst displaying a profound interest in the working class, Clark appears very far from such an approach. Given Clark's non-recognition of class struggle prior to Gorbachev, it's hardly surprising that Clark does not attempt to identify the nature of the force of the workers in terms of any sort of polarity or singularity. As a result, Clark gives far too much credence to the, quote, management's identification of the enterprise with the labor collective, end quote, and eventually reaches the view that the most radical aspect of workers' struggle is its tendency to push for enterprise democratization at meetings of worker shareholders. See also Clark, 1993. Workers' actual practice at the point, quote, point of production, end quote, when they're actually working, is left out of the picture altogether. He undoubtedly does deserve credit for stating that it was the miners' strikes of 1989 and 1991 which brought the system down, even if Clark excises this opinion from a later rewrite. But Clark imbues this statement with virtually no theoretical or historical force. Among the other weaknesses already mentioned, Clark's democratism, limited theory of accumulation, and lack of critique of either the enterprise form or the wage form prevent Clark from achieving a profound grasp of the real antagonism involved. New section, a summary. In considering what various, quote, Marxist, end quote, theories of the nature of the Soviet system have had to say upon the nature of the working class and the working class's struggle, we have pointed to considerable weaknesses, and in many cases, a remarkable level of superficiality. We shall now summarize the criticisms made. We have shown how the understanding of Soviet political economy by the proponents of the, quote, worker state theory touches upon class conflict solely in terms of a static, quote, conflict of interest, end quote, in the abstractly differentiated sphere of distribution. It should therefore come as no surprise that there is no real consideration of the actual class struggle between the workers on one side and the exploiters and their state on the other. Neither Trotsky nor Ernest Mandel have any real interest in any form of class struggle which might correspond to the overall political economy. It is considerably more surprising that very much the same criticism can be made of almost all the numerous, quote, capitalist, end quote, theorists who have also worked within, quote, Marxism, from Tony Cliff and Grandizo Muniz to Charles Bettelheim and Amadeo Bordiga. We have shown above how they too have done little more than to rhetoricize about the workers' total powerlessness. Chris Harman, of course, can hardly ignore the struggles which have taken place since 1985, but aside from a few remarks about the growth of the exploited class since the 1920s, Chris Harman paints a picture wherein the class struggle became, quote, actual, end quote, rather than potential only under Gorbachev. A welcome exception here is Chavant's, but even as Chavant's describes the inherent tension between workers and the exploitative system, Chavant's fails to devote any attention to the struggle at the point of production. Sapir, meanwhile, pays greater attention to labor conflict, but Sapir paints labor conflict's forms as being unilaterally determined by capitalist competition, both enterprise directors and ministries, and among the enterprise directors themselves. In this view, workers do struggle, but workers struggle only in mechanically determined ways, which stem from causes but lead to no significant effects. The first collectivist theorists, meanwhile, fail to study the issue of class struggle in much the same way as Cliff and Muniz. Where Bruno Rizzi and James Burnham refer directly to workers' powerlessness in so many words, Max Shachtman makes little effort to fit the concessions of the mid-1950s into Shachtman's general theoretical critique. Later sui generis work by, quote, dissidents is somewhat more developed. Thus, Gillas pays some attention to low-quality production, even if Gillas sees it ultimately as a product of the overly, quote, dogmatic, end quote, orientation of the controllers of the economy. But the clear implication is that a less, quote, political, end quote, style of economic management would smooth over any problems of workers' lack of interest in economic efficiency. Viewing the role of the, quote, political, end quote, in just as extreme a fashion, Thayer, Heller, and Marcus later take the view that what problematic self-assertion there actually is on the part of the workers, seen largely as a matter of consumption choices, is oppositional to bureaucratic interests, mainly because it pushes towards marketization. For their part, Benson Kiss, or under the name, quote, Rakovsky, similarly omit to consider working class struggle in any more profound terms than those of individual behavior and the, quote, objectively strengthened, end quote, position of the worker's household as a consumer. Koran and Mojalevsky go much further, conceiving of the lowering of efficiency and product quality as a matter of a, quote, massive social initiative, end quote, rather than as an accumulation of individual reactions. But even as they scorn the idea that such a class relation depends on mismanagement, insisting instead on its roots in, quote, existing conditions, end quote, they too display an overdetermined interest in market demand and virtually end up arguing that higher workers' consumption would help the economy. Subsequent, quote, collectivist, end quote, work by Carlo has also the merit of emphasizing the importance of workers' opposition, stating outright that low productivity is an expression of the workers' rejection of the system. Carlo understands that the system must organically concede a, quote, moderate work rhythm, end quote. But Antonio Carlo fails to isolate the relation between the workers and the exploiters and hone in on it with adequate rigor. And as a result, when Carlo comes to consider the crisis, Carlo gives great weight to such factors as the petering out of extensive growth and the structural innovation problem, rather than attempting to trace any material lines of determination from the class struggle. Fantham and Machover's analysis, meanwhile, being very mixed up, represents a step backward. Fantham and Machover may emphasize low productivity, but Fantham and Machover's confusion over the essence of control, taking forms which are administrative, ideological, and transparent, prevents Fantham and Machover from formulating any coherent framework for understanding class struggle. Writing about aspects of labor conflict since 1989, Clark presents a theoretical analysis which is equally confused. Having moved on from his previous view focusing on the systemic need to expand the, quote, labor collective, end quote, Clark admittedly points to the strength of the workers' position in relation to the labor process. But Clark fails to relate this to any dynamic consideration of the system's internal contradictions, and ultimately portrays class struggle as little more than a product of perestroika. Of the many, quote, Marxists, end quote, who have presented theoretical views of the political economic nature of the Soviet system, few have brought into their theorization a consideration of working class struggle, and even those who have done so, such as Kuran, Mogilevsky, and Carlo, have failed to trace through the class polarities with consistent historical and theoretical resolution. Okay, so that is the end of chapter. What chapter is this again? I think it's chapter 5. It is chapter 5. I got it right. Of Capitalism and Class Struggle in the USSR by Neil C. Fernandez. This chapter was titled Class Struggle, quote, Marxist, end quote, Theories. Thank you so much for listening. The next chapter, chapter 6, is titled The Class Struggle, A Critique of Existing Marxist Theories. Thank you so much for listening.